Hello everyone, welcome to the unit on mental imagery. We're talking about the Shepherd study alongside the Polition piece. Let's go ahead and get started. So the early approaches to AI and computation relied heavily on this approach that was sort of like computer coding, where you type in commands, you have symbols represent things in the environment or represent, various things that you might need to compute over, and you essentially treat cognition perhaps as like a program, and maybe that's what our brains are doing. They're running some sort of mindware or software in terms of executing commands and performing calculations over those commands. But alongside this, I mean, for even looking at your own subjective experience of the world, most of us have pretty rich mental imagery, right? We see things, we can sort of imagine complex environments. We can work, as we'll see in the Shepherd piece, work out sort of physical or almost spatial type of problems in our head. Is this commiserate with, can we explain this using the propositional or linguistic approaches, or do we need something like imagistic representation in order to best explain that? So this is where Polition and studies like Shepherd's and a bunch of others that Polition cites too are debating whether we need to account for something like mentalistic or imagistic representation in the mind, or if we can do this with some more basic propositional type of account. So let's first go over the Shepherd study. As you read, they had to determine whether the object was indeed the same object or a different one entirely. They didn't specify how to do this, but an easy way to do it is just sort of flip the object continuously in your head to see if, this is my flipping hand rotation, to see if it's the same object or not. When they found, the results were that the results were clear that it looked like something like mental rotating was going on. Why? Well, the response times, how quickly they answered whether it was the same object or not, depended on the number of rotations that one had to perform in order to get it to match the same object. Of course, if it didn't match, you'd expect it to be quite long because they'd have to go through the full rotations. Or if there was a clear difference, perhaps they didn't have to do any rotations, but generally you'd think longer response times. And they were linear in the sense that each rotation seemed to take about the same amount of time. So the easiest or simplest explanation seems to be, well, even when we ask the people, right, how did you figure out whether they were the same object or not? Most people are going to say, I rotated it in my head and sort of tried to see if the two matched. And so I was trying to determine whether or not they're the same object simply by rotating them and trying to find a match. So that's some clear results that seem to be like, look, here is this clear-cut study where response time to the stimuli is linearly related to the amount of rotations that you have to do. And it seems like a straightforward explanation is, well, even when we ask them, they tell us how they're doing it, and they're rotating those objects, right? And here's where Polition wants to come in and caution us about levels of explanation. So 2 questions that Polition is going to offer us about mental images generally. Can the concept of image be useful without, can the concept of image exist without being reduced further? And so the thought is there some further explanation beyond image that is sort of, below the level of conscious access that will explain the results of studies like Shepard and Metzler's. And the second question, does the common sense understanding of this term, images, so I think Polishion's answer to these questions are images can be, or at least in principle, can be reduced further, and this possibility has not been adequately explored. And the second one, I think he thinks it certainly carries unintended implications, and some of these might be sort of methodological pitfalls that we need to avoid. So first, let's talk a little bit about levels of explanation, and especially levels of sort of conscious access. So introspective reports on mental processes are likely an account of what one experienced doing, but may not be explanatorily useful. I think a cool example of this is expert chess players who you ask them, why did you move your queen in that situation? And given enough time, they could sit down and work through all of the permutations of the move. They could explain the costs or the risks and the benefits of making that move. They could explain, what sort of game state was in, what state the game was in, and where they felt that moving the queen would give them a bigger advantage. All the things that a grandmaster or a good chess player would tell you. But when you ask chess players, how did you make that decision in real time, they're going to tell you, I just felt it was the right move intuitively. Now, of course, they are doing calculations when they're playing. They're not simply going off their gut the entire time. But it's impossible for a chess player, especially in lightning quick games of chess where you have a certain amount of time for all of your turns and it's very low, or even longer games, right? You can't work through all of the different options. And indeed, when you ask people that are experts in that area to explain, they say, I had a gut feeling, or I had an intuition, or I just felt it was the right move. That doesn't explain a whole lot about why they made that choice. And I think it's important that a lot of those intuitive decisions are based on hours and hours and hours of study and practice, right? They've practiced so much that they probably have seen a board state like the one that they were in, thought about the types of moves that worked in that situation, and then find a similar move or something like that, right? And this is a much better explanation. It's more adequate in terms of what Polishon would say. Because it's going to better explain why that move was made than the fact that they just had a feeling, right? And this isn't to say that they are inaccurately reporting that they had a feeling. Of course they did. And we would expect that given the amount of time they've put into honing their craft, right? But the thought is that the explanation that we're looking for, especially if we want to do something like model this, right? The explanation that we're looking for is not going to be at that level. It's going to be a level lower, and it's going to include the things that they learned and the patterns they observed in their hours and hours of repetition. The subject themselves don't have immediate conscious access to that. Perhaps if they had long enough, they could sort of recall various games that they played where they were in that position, but that's not what they're doing in real time. And indeed, they might not even have conscious access to some of the patterns that they're realizing. So I think just like that chess player example, Polishon thinks that there's two different kinds of seeing, and they relate to these sort of different levels of, I don't want to say different levels of consciousness, but maybe different levels of access, right? Because all of these are included in cognition, but you would think that one is more basic than the other. So two different kinds of seeing. One seeing is the actual processing of visual stimuli in the environment by our visual system, right? So it's the actual machinery of vision, more or less. When we say we see something, we mean light reflected off the surface of that object and propelled back and when my retina and so on and so forth until the brain processes it, creates a representation, et cetera, et cetera. But another use is describing our own conscious experience of that. And it seems to accompany the lower level explanation in that, like, I see a blue light on the camera I'm looking at. And that is one type of seeing, but it's not the same as the bottom level processing that's going on, right? It's a qualitative what it's like of experience, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not identical to the actual nitty-gritty processing of the visual system. Our subjective conscious experience is available to us through introspection. We can sort of, that's how I was able to tell you I'm seeing a blue light, right? Is that I sort of introspect and said, well, what sorts of features am I visually aware of in my environment? A blue light. But I can't sort of be consciously aware of the light in my retina or, various levels V1 and V2 of the visual system, what's going on in terms of processing. I'm not aware of that. I don't have conscious access to it. Plisson thinks this is an important distinction because the implications that image has are all implied by this latter version of seeing or image, the conscious experience of it. And he thinks maybe we're packing too much of that into this sort of more basic level explanation. So one of his big targets in this paper is Bugelski, and others who take mental imagery very seriously and think all representation in the brain seems to be either words or images. And indeed, most of them suggest that you can sort of flip back and forth between them. So I think there's an example of like government, right, where maybe you can do various word associations with government, like gridlock, Congress, Washington, D.C., Democrats, Republicans, whatever. And you might also have imagistic pictures that come up when you think about the government. You think about like a gavel, or you think about Washington, D.C., you think about Trump, the White House, whatever, right? You might be able to flip back and forth between those two types of representation, and but sort of that exhausts all of the representational capacities that the brain has. Plisson thinks this is unsatisfactory. And in part, I think a key point here is that he thinks we might represent both of those things, but there's something even more basic or perhaps more basic or more primitive than either words or images. And indeed, he thinks this is necessary if people can switch between the two. If you can go from images to words or words to images, he thinks there must be a form of representation which is not accessible in subjective experience. So that's the reason we don't sort of have conscious access to it, and subjects won't report it in studies, but it encompasses both words and images and allows for translation between the two. So one problem with thinking about images in terms of representation as sort of one problem for thinking about images as the most basic level of representation is it gets you in theoretical trouble, Plisson thinks. He picks on Bauer, who distinguishes between memory for appearances, how things look, and memory for facts, what things resemble. And Bauer argues that this runs parallel between imagistic memory and propositional memory. So, cool, we have these two versions of representation, and they fit nicely with two different ways that we think the brain might encode memory, either in images or in propositions. Plisson makes a distinction here that he thinks is really crucial. Philosophers love distinctions, between the subjective experience of recalling the sound. So this is the example of recalling or remembering what the opera sounds like. So on the one hand, you have this subjective experience of recalling what the opera sounds like. Maybe you remember the last opera you attended, or something on the radio you heard, or whatever the case may be. And B, the functional information which enables us to make judgments of relative similarity between two instruments. So what is the information that our auditory system is processing that allows us to discriminate between two images and sort of think about the differences and similarities between the two? Polition thinks the term appearance is surely meant to apply just to A, our subjective experience of the sounds or images or whatever, right? Whatever we have conscious access to, because we can make a computer that could sort of use the functional information that we do to make sound discriminations, like a tuner, right, is a good example of a machine or computer that utilizes auditory information to tune an instrument or something. But are we going to really say that there's any sense in which sound appears to that machine? Maybe, but it doesn't seem, at least on the face of it, very plausible, or at the very least, it seems as though it's a different kind of appearance than the one that we experience, right? So the problem with applying appearance to both A and B is that it seems confused to talk about appearance in the terms of B. And we seem to want to keep that with just A. Another mistake Polition thinks is propositions are often expressed in words, but they're not necessarily the words themselves. They need not be represented in words. You might use numbers. You might use logic. It can be cashed out in any language or modality, but it need not be words. And he thinks it's problematic to assume that it needs to be. So what Polition thinks we mean when we say the word see or when we use the word see is we're referring to a bridge between a pattern of sensory stimulation and knowledge, which is propositional. It need not be words. In fact, when you think that you see a vase on the table, you might not have any representation of vase, table in terms of words. You have the conscious experience of seeing an image, but the knowledge itself, he thinks, is propositional, and it's sort of it need not be expressed in language, and you might not even have that sentence come to your mind while still knowing it. He doesn't want to deny that you have subjective experience, importantly, crucially, but he wants to say that how things appear to you in subjective experience might not necessarily play a role in an explanatorily adequate scientific theory. And that includes things like reporting on mental processes, like rotating an image, right? So he thinks maybe there's something more basic that's below the level of conscious awareness that is going on here and explains this. So there's these three different quotes. I'll let you read what they are about mental images, but the idea seems to be something like, activation of a certain sensory pattern without actually having stimuli. So you might think, if I wanted to activate sort of the image of the U of A campus, I'm sort of recalling, maybe say Old Main, right, where I'm recalling the times that I've walked on campus and seen Old Main, and I'm reactivating sensory patterns like that. But I don't have conscious access to it, right, because I'm looking at a camera at my home office. I'm not anywhere by campus, but I'm activating that similar sensory stimulation that I had when I was on campus and I saw Old Main. One worry that Polishin has that these theorists are using definitions that are slightly different than each other, and they're unifying them without sort of cause in the definitions themselves, but they're unifying them for the reason that we have these associations with our subjective experience of images and our visual access to images. And we're sort of importing those, importing those things about subjective experience of images to the more basic types of images that might actually be explanatorily useful in these studies. So essentially, he's worried here that we're blending together that conscious subjective experience level with this computational level, and that's perhaps, he thinks, radically inappropriate, and there might be a more basic level explanation that so this, I think the point where he's sort of making this point about how bad the metaphor could be is sort of, it's tough to follow, but I'm going to give the gloss that I think is hopefully helpful and I think captures what he's going after. So one major implication of this metaphor, he thinks, is that the subjective experience of a memory image precedes its interpretation by the usual perceptual processes. Why is this so? Well, when you're trying to recall something, you're going to use mental imagery representation, and by doing so, it necessarily comes before the reactivation of the sensory stimulation, right? This is problematic for a few reasons. Well, I should say it's problematic primarily because it makes it difficult to understand how the brain is retrieving this information. One, if information is received through senses and then stored in memory and retrieved at a later date, well, the brain better have a ton of storage, given all of the different ways the environment can vary and all of the sorts of images that it's going to need to store in order to, say, recall Old Main from a certain angle at a certain time of day with certain weather conditions, with certain amounts of people around, or whatever the case may be, right? And Polishin thinks this is impossible for the brain to do, to have this much storage to save all of the iterations of, say, a certain environment that I have. One way to avoid this, well, maybe they're just stored as the raw functional information. But then we have the difficulty of, well, how is the brain sort of finding which ones are appropriate? Maybe it tags and labels them with certain keywords. But then we have the problem of sort of paring down which keywords to use when recalling a certain memory, and how to pare down this list of plausible candidates, where candidates are individual sensory events in terms of raw functional information. And what I mean by that, I should be more careful about, this is a lot of technical jargon to throw at you guys. What I mean by that is whatever the sorts of input that the brain is processing and using to form a representation, that's being stored as however the brain is receiving it, right? Let's just, for ease of access, say we're just seeing a bunch of numbers, mathematical relationships in the environment. And so maybe I take a snapshot of a mental image and write down all the numbers that come in, and the brain says, all right, well, here's all of the functional information that applies to a computer with a blue screen, with a camera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so summary so far. I think we just went over all this stuff. I'll let you guys read the slide, but what I really want you to get from this is the fact that Polishin thinks there's a confusion between, or at least there's a blurring of the lines between this, what we have subjective awareness of, and what's going on in the brain as sort of the bottom level of processing. So, alternative ways of representing. One, propositional. That's what we've seen in sort of the weak and strong AI, utilizing a list of propositions that represent beliefs or facts. Symbols or variables that represent objects, things, abstract categories and environment concepts, and mathematical or sort of logical operations that can perform on those symbols. Benefits that this way of representing has. Well, one is that it gets to use logic and mathematical structure, which is nice. And secondly, it's generative in the sense that you can produce new propositions just based on the fact that you can combine them in different ways and perform operations on them. One problem for classical AI and propositional approaches is the frame problem. We don't need to get into the details of the frame problem, but essentially it's the difficulty of dealing with and updating in response to a changing world. How does a system that's a list of propositions, how does it decide what information is relevant to update and what is not? This is a classic problem for these early approaches to AI, and it's one that is a problem for propositional representation. Data structure, again, very close to propositional representation, but emphasizes the relationship between so data structure representation is very similar to propositional representation. I guess for our purposes, what I want you to come away with for data structure is that it improves on propositional representation by paying close attention to relationships between the things that it's representing. So whereas a propositional system might just have a list of symbols that refer to entities and some different ways to combine them, a data structure representation is going to say, well, rabbit and fur are both represented, but they also have a close relationship in that rabbits often have fur, right? Or rabbit and big hind feet or whatever, they're gonna both be represented and have this relationship that they usually like coexist with each other or something like that. Or that at least rabbits usually have large hind feet because lots of other animals have large hind feet, right? So close to propositional representation, but I'd want you to take away that the relationships between entities in the system are more closely examined. Procedural representation changes it quite a bit. It says, look, another way to represent cognition is in terms of rules, and rules can apply in lots of different environments. Rules can be simple, like just think about a rule that's associated with gravity, right? Unless there are extenuating circumstances, generally speaking, things tend to fall when they get thrown in the air. Here's a rule, you can apply it in lots of different domains, and it tends to work. And you might update that rule when you come into environments that are sort of specialized, that don't have that. Maybe you go in a gravity-free, you could go up in space and you're not in a gravitational field, so you think, all right, this rule no longer applies in this domain. But you can see how rules sort of would do a lot of representational work, and it's economical because they are not domain specific. You can apply them in a wide variety of environments and situations. But I think the negatives or drawbacks to this form of representation is there's a lack of models, and sometimes it's hard to see how this applies to human cognition and perceptual systems. But it's an alternative, and it's one that might be utilized, and indeed probably is utilized by humans, at least in a lot of different cognitive faculties. Okay, so that will do it for this mental imagery presentation. Hopefully that helped a little bit. I know that volition piece was pretty tough, but I think it's important and useful, especially for a lot of you that are in cognitive science, to think about the levels of sort of, maybe not levels of consciousness, but separating, say, what's going on in subjective experience versus maybe what's going on more basically. So hopefully this video